My mobile grooming van smelled violently, irredeemably of skunk. My eyes watered so hard, I could barely see my own reflection in the dog-washing mirror. I clamped a threadbare beach towel between my teeth, frantically peeling off my ruined sweater without contaminating my skin. "Don't look," I yelled at the empty, suffocatingly small space, wrestling the fabric over my head. "I am not looking." The voice didn't come from my head. It came from the shadows beside the industrial blow-dryer, a deep, gravelly vibration that rattled the metal shelving. I froze. The sweater dropped to the linoleum. I clutched the flimsy towel tight against my chest, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm. "Who is that?" "Close your eyes, I am trying." The massive shadow shifted. The van groaned under his weight. Two amber eyes caught the dim street lamp bleeding through the window, completely unblinking. "But my wolf sees everything. Your wolf is a pervert." I didn't think, I reacted. My hand blindly scrambled across the grooming cart, closing around a heavy bottle of organic tick-repellent shampoo. I squeezed the bottle with both hands, firing a thick, foaming green stream directly into those glowing eyes. He let out a sharp, breathless curse, stumbling backward. I didn't wait for him to recover. I grabbed the nearest solid object, a heavy-duty metal dematting comb, and swung it like a baseball bat. Thwack! The crack of metal against a thick skull echoed in the cramped van. The giant man went down with a heavy, ungraceful thud, his knee giving out with a loud, sickening pop, leaving me completely breathless, clutching a dog brush like a murder weapon. Welcome back to Tiana's Romance Collections. I'm Tiana, and if you love fiercely independent heroines and the massive werewolf shifters who fall hopelessly in love with them, hit that subscribe button. Now, let's get into today's audiobook. Chapter 1. The guy was the size of a commercial refrigerator. He was currently folded into the narrow space between the hydrobath and my supply cabinet, clutching a neon pink microfiber dog towel to his forehead. Green tick-repellent bubbles slid slowly down his completely straight, stubbornly aristocratic nose. "Don't move," I ordered. My voice was shaking, but I masked it by swatting the metal dematting comb for a heavy-duty pair of guillotine-style nail clippers. "I know exactly how to use these. I wrestle angry mastiffs for a living. You're just a slightly larger, significantly more annoying breed." He blinked, the harsh overhead fluorescent light catching the soapy stinging tears pooling in his eyes. He let out a low groan, rubbing his left knee with a hand the size of a hubcap. His face contorted in a very genuine, distinctly unintimidating grimace of pain. "I am not going to hurt you," he wheezed, wiping a thick glob of foaming mint suds from his strong jaw. "You practically shattered my kneecap. You broke into my workspace." I snapped, yanking my threadbare towel tighter around my collarbone. The pungent, acidic stench of skunk was still burning the back of my throat, but now it was violently clashing with the aggressive peppermint and eucalyptus oils from the shampoo I'd just blinded him with. It was an olfactory nightmare. Who even are you? What kind of local creep hides in the dark of a mobile's pet salon? He let out a heavy, rattling sigh that literally shifted the suspension of the Ford Transit. "I was hiding," he grumbled, his gaze fixed respectfully, and perhaps fearfully, on the ceiling to avoid looking at my bare shoulders. "My pack, they set me up. A blind date. At the seafood diner down the street." I stared at him, trying to process the absurdity. "You're hiding from a blind date, in the back of my van, like a teenager evading curfew?" "Because she brought a spreadsheet," he corrected. His deep, gravelly voice was deadpan, yet deeply defensive. "A printed, color-coded spreadsheet of my administrative flaws, municipal failures, and genetic viability. She cornered me by the oyster bar. Your side door was unlocked. So your first logistical instinct was a felony?" I took a deliberate half-step forward, pointing the sharp steel clippers directly at his broad chest. He took up entirely too much oxygen in the cramped space, his massive shoulders wedged between a jug of conditioner and a box of dog treats. "Listen to me very carefully. I have two maxed out Zars, an engine that sounds like a dying lawnmower, and a predatory loan officer breathing down my neck, I absolutely do not have the insurance coverage for a home invasion by a defective werewolf. I am the head of the local pack, he muttered, trying to salvage a shred of dignity while dabbing his bleeding temple with the pink towel. I am not defective. I am highly respected. You're sitting in a puddle of anal gland expression fluid. He froze. His broad shoulders stiffened, and he slowly looked down at the damp, questionable spot on the linoleum currently soaking into his dark denim jeans. The sheer existential horror that washed over his rugged features was intensely, profoundly satisfying. Before he could muster a defense, 3 sharp, aggressively rhythmic knocks rattled the thin metal of the van's side door. "Arthur?" A woman's voice called out from the street, sharp enough to cut glass. "I can smell your damp fur. And skunk? Come out here, Arthur. We haven't finished discussing your abysmal quarter-through-tax filings." Arthur, the supposedly massive, highly respected, terrifying local pack leader, visibly flinched. He pressed his enormous frame harder against the supply cabinet like a frightened toddler avoiding a scolding. He looked up at me, his glowing amber eyes wide with actual, unfiltered panic. "Please," he whispered, his deep voice barely a scrape of sound. I looked at him. I looked at the terrifying nail clippers in my hand. I thought about my ruined, exhausted evening, my skunk-soaked clothes, and the sheer, unadulterated audacity of my terrible luck. "Hold on to something," I told him. I dropped the clippers, vaulted over the center console into the driver's seat, and slammed my key into the ignition. The old engine screamed a violent protest. The polite knocking on the side door instantly turned into a furious, demanding pound. I threw the gear shift into drive, white-knuckling the steering wheel, and stomped on the gas pedal. Chapter 2. The tires of the Pause and Reflect mobile grooming van let out a pathetic, high-pitched squeal, a sound more akin to a stepped-on guinea pig than a high-speed getaway, before the heavy vehicle lurched, aggressively away from the curb. Behind me, the chaotic clatter of unsecured inventory told a story of absolute physical disaster. Bottles of hypoallergenic dog shampoo, heavy-duty ear wipes, and a massive jug of industrial de-shedding conditioner crashed to the linoleum floor. "Watch out!" I yelled over the deafening roar of the struggling 4-cylinder engine. "I am currently wedged against a 50-pound bag of kibble." Arthur's deep voice rumbled, punctuated by the heavy thud of his massive body hitting the side panel as I took a sharp, highly ill-advised left turn onto Elm Street. Are we fleeing the scene of a crime?" "We are establishing a tactical retreat," I shouted back, keeping my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. The street behind us was empty, save for the rapidly shrinking figure of his spreadsheet-wielding date, shaking her fist under a streetlight. "There is a massive difference. Mostly, it depends on my insurance deductibles." I gripped the steering wheel so hard, my knuckles turned a bruised shade of white. The van was shaking violently, vibrating up through my arms and into my teeth. The speedometer needle trembled violently as it fought its way to the agonizingly slow speed of 12 miles per hour. Arthur's massive frame suddenly appeared in the partition window. He had managed to stand up, hunched over, so his head wouldn't hit the ceiling, his wide shoulders taking up the entire rectangular frame. He had wiped most of the mint-green suds from his face, but a single stubborn glob of bubbles clung to his left eyebrow. Mud and anal gland fluid stained his jeans. He looked like a very large, incredibly dangerous man who had recently lost a fight with a car wash. "You are a remarkably aggressive driver for someone moving at the speed of a brisk walk," he observed. His tone was perfectly flat, deadpan, and deeply judgmental. "This is a commercial vehicle carrying 300 gallons of recycled bath water." I snapped, shooting him a furious glare in the rearview mirror. It wasn't built for evasive maneuvers. It was built for suburban driveways. "She is not chasing us, you know," he pointed out mildly, resting his enormous forearms on the metal partition. He was entirely too calm. His amber eyes caught the passing streetlights, flashing with a strange, amused warmth. "Clarissa prefers to resolve her reads through certified mail. You can slow down." I am holding the pedal to the floor, I informed him, my voice dripping with cold, exhausted sarcasm. This is it. This is the top speed. If Clarissa starts lightly jogging, she will overtake us in approximately 4 minutes. Arthur opened his mouth to reply, but the Ford Transit beat him to it. We had just entered the intersection of Main and Oak when the transmission decided it had finally endured abuse for one lifetime. A sound like a metallic cannon blast ripped through the undercarriage. The van violently lurched forward, throwing me against the seatbelt before abruptly dropping into a heavy, dead drift. Thick, acrid black smoke instantly billowed out from under the hood, perfectly masking the acidic scent of skunk. "No, no, no," I whispered, desperately pumping the gas pedal. Nothing. Just the heavy, hollow silence of a dead engine and the rhythmic ticking of the hazard lights. We were completely, unequivocally stranded in the dead center of town. Arthur let out a low, gravelly hum from the back. I assume this was not part of the tactical retreat? I am going to start crying, I warned him, resting my forehead heavily against the steering wheel. I am going to cry, and then I am going to charge you for the emotional labor. Do not cry, Arthur said quickly, his voice dropping into a rough, surprisingly frantic register. I heard the heavy clunk of the side door unlatching. I will handle this. I have the physical strength of 5 men. I will simply push the vehicle to the shoulder. I lifted my head, exhausted curiosity overriding my panic. I watched through the passenger window as Arthur stepped out into the misty street. He rolled up the sleeves of his flannel shirt, exposing thick, corded forearms, heavily corded with muscle. He took a deep, centering breath, looking every inch the formidable, terrifying alpha of local legend. He squared his broad shoulders, preparing to single-handedly push a 3-ton waterlogged van. He took exactly one confident, powerful step backward. His heavy steel-toed boot caught the jagged edge of a discarded plastic hubcap. The terrifying alpha did not stumble. He did not waver. He simply went down like a felled redwood. It was a spectacular gravity-defying wipeout. His bad knee, the one I had already compromised with the dog brush, gave out entirely. He pitched backward, arms windmilling in the damp air, before crashing face-first into a shockingly deep, mud-filled pothole next to the curb. A massive geyser of dirty street water splashed over the sidewalk. A heavy, stunned silence descended upon the intersection. I stared out the window. Arthur was lying flat on his back, a soggy fast food wrapper stuck to his chest heaving. A bubble of air escaped my throat, then a snort. Within seconds, I was doubled over the steering wheel, laughing so hard my ribs ached and tears streamed down my face. It was the hysterical, broken laughter of a woman who had lost absolutely everything and was left with nothing but the sheer absurdity of the universe. Through the cracked passenger window, I heard Arthur groan, pulling himself up onto his elbows. He looked at me, dripping with mud, his imposing aura entirely destroyed. But he wasn't glaring. He was watching me laugh, the corners of his mouth twitching upward, his amber eyes locked onto my face, with an intense, burning fascination that made my breath suddenly catch in my throat. Chapter 3. The fluorescent lights of Smitty's 24-hour grill buzzed with the frantic, erratic energy of a dying wasp. The diner smelled heavily of burnt coffee, stale fryer grease, and the unmistakable metallic tang of despair. It was the only place open at 1 a.m, and the only place that would tolerate the arrival of 2 people who smelled like a combination of angry skunk, cheap mint, and municipal sewer water. I slid into the cracked red vinyl booth, wincing as the cold material bit into my bare legs. I still had the threadbare beach towel draped awkwardly over my shoulders, shivering in the damp, drafty air. Arthur slid into the booth across from me. Or, rather, he attempted to. He was simply too large for the structural integrity of the furniture. His broad shoulders hung over the edges of the seat, and his incredibly long legs instantly tangled with mine, beneath the sticky linoleum table. I pulled my knees back, trying to ignore the sudden, intense rush of heat radiating off his damp jeans. "You are taking up 80% of the foot space," I hissed, kicking his heavy boot under the table. My femur is mathematically longer than your entire torsos, Arthur grumbled, shifting uncomfortably and wincing as his bad knee bumped the metal table leg. I am making a physical compromise. Before I could argue the spatial dynamics, a waitress appeared. She was a woman in her late 60s with a towering blonde beehive, a name tag that read Brenda, and eyes that suggested she had witnessed the rise and fall of several civilizations. She held a stained notepad and did not look impressed. Arthur cleared his throat. He sat up straighter, his chest expanding as he tapped into that deep, chest-rattling register of command. I require your strongest, darkest coffee, he rumbled, his voice echoing off the cheap linoleum floor. It was a voice designed to make men tremble and wolves submit. And a plate of raw, unseasoned steak, thick cut. Bring it immediately. Brenda did not flinch. She did not tremble. She simply popped her chewing gum, stared blankly at his muddy forehead, and poured a single glass of tap water onto the table. Grill's off for steak, honey, Brenda deadpanned, her voice like sandpaper. You can have pancakes, eggs, or a tuna melt that's been under the heat lamp since Thursday. Arthur blinked, entirely disarmed by his lack of authority. But I am. He will have the Grand Slam breakfast, I interrupted loudly, snatching the laminated menu out of Arthur's massive hands. Extra bacon, crispy. I will have the same, plus a side of Hashik Browns, 2 black coffees, and bring him the check immediately. He's paying for everything. Brenda nodded, scrawled something on her pad, and shuffled away without another word. Arthur stared at me across the table, his heavy brow furrowed in deep, utter bewilderment. You just ordered for me and demanded I pay. You are currently an active liability, I told him, leaning forward and resting my elbows on the sticky table. Let's review the evening, shall we? You trespassed in my vehicle. You caused me to use a bottle of organic tick shampoo that retails for $42. You forced me into a high-stress evasion maneuver that ultimately detonated my transmission. And you smell terrible. You also smell terrible, he pointed out defensively. Because of you, I snapped, gesturing wildly to my towel-clad shoulders. My van is dead, my clothes are ruined. My insurance premiums are going to skyrocket. So yes, you are buying me extra bacon. Frankly, you're lucky I'm not making you sign over the deed to your house. I expected him to growl. I expected him to flex his massive shoulders, assert his dominance, or at least argue the financial logistics of the transmission failure. Instead, he just watched me. His glowing amber eyes tracked the movement of my hands, the frantic flutter of my pulse at my throat, the sharp, cynical set of my jaw. The defensive anger in his posture slowly melted away, replaced by a slow, heavy, suffocating kind of heat. He leaned back against the red vinyl, crossing his massive arms over his chest. You are not afraid of me, he said softly. It wasn't a question, it was a realization. I am currently afraid of the IRS, my loan officer, and the structural integrity of this diner's bathroom. I shot back, refusing to break eye contact. A clumsy guy who trips over hubcaps doesn't even make the top 10. A slow, devastating smirk pulled at the corner of his mouth. A clumsy guy, he repeated, the gravel in his voice dropping an octave. Is that what you think I am? I think you're a guy who owes me $42 for shampoo, I replied, my voice suddenly feeling a little breathless. The air between us had grown strangely thick, heavy with the sharp scent of coffee, and the unnatural, burning heat radiating off his skin. He leaned across the table, closing the distance between us, until I could see the tiny flecks of gold in his eyes. I will buy you 100 bottles of shampoo, he murmured, his gaze dropping momentarily to my lips. If you keep looking at me like that. Before my brain could formulate a suitably biting comeback, the diner window was completely washed out by the blinding, rotating yellow lights of a massive tow truck pulling into the parking lot. The driver of the tow truck was a man named Gary. Gary was a man of very few words, but he compensated for his silence by eating a family-size bag of extra crunchy corn nuts with an open-mouthed enthusiasm that bordered on violence. The cab of the tow truck was designed for 2 average-sized adults. It was not designed for Gary, me, and a 250-pound wall of muscle. I was crammed into the middle seat, wedged so tightly against Arthur that I couldn't tell where my body ended and his began. Every time Gary hit a bump in the dilapidated coastal road, Arthur's massive thigh pressed flush against mine. The heat radiating off him was entirely unnatural. It wasn't just warm, it was a heavy, sinking heat, like sitting too close to an industrial furnace. I kept my hands folded tightly in my lap, staring rigidly ahead through the rain-streaked windshield, trying desperately to ignore the way his chest expanded against my shoulder. Every time took a breath. Crunch, 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 Gary chewed, staring blankly at the road. Arthur shifted uncomfortably beside me. His broad shoulders were hunched, his knees jammed awkwardly against the dashboard. He smelled like damp earth, stale diner coffee, and something deep and primal that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. "Are you cold?" Arthur asked suddenly. His deep voice was pitched low, meant only for me beneath the deafening crunch of Gary's snack. "No," I lied, shivering slightly beneath my borrowed diner jacket. The reality was that my adrenaline was crashing, leaving me utterly exhausted and hyper-aware of the freezing draft coming through the truck's faulty weather stripping. Arthur let out a soft huff of disbelief. I watched out of the corner of my eye as he subtly shifted his weight. He was trying to be smooth. He was attempting the classic, historically terrible maneuver of casually stretching his arm out and draping it behind my shoulders to pull me closer to his unnatural body heat. I felt the heavy weight of his arm settle behind the headrest. I felt his large hand hover just inches from my opposite shoulder. The air in the cab seemed to evaporate. My breath hitched. For a single terrifying second, I actually wanted him to close this distance. I wanted to lean into that massive, solid chest and let the absolute disaster of the evening just melt away. The romantic tension was thick, heavy, and undeniably electric. And then his knee gave out. The cramped angle, the prior blunt force trauma from the dog brush, and the spectacular wipeout over the hubcap finally culminated in a violent, physiological rebellion. Arthur's leg violently seized up. A loud, wet pop echoed through the cab, entirely overpowering the sound of Gary's corn nuts. Arthur let out a strangled, breathless scream of absolute agony. "Gah!" he bellowed, his massive body instinctively twisting. His arm, which had been romantically hovering behind me, violently flailed forward, smacking the dashboard. He collapsed sideways, burying his face into my shoulder, his massive hands gripping his knee like it was trying to detach itself from his body. "What happened?" I shrieked, myself against the dashboard to give his seizing limb room. "Are you dying?" "Cramp!" he wheezed into my collarbone, his entire body trembling. "Massive, catastrophic, muscle failure." Gary slowly chewed a corn nut, glanced over at the mountain of a man sobbing into my shoulder, and looked back at the road. "Gotta hydrate, buddy." "It's a localized spasm," Arthur groaned, his breath hot against my neck. I need to straighten the leg. You're in a Ford F-350, you absolute giant." "There is nowhere to straighten it," I yelled, frantically grabbing his heavy thigh and trying to massage the locked muscle. This is what happens when you skip physical therapy. You think because you're an alpha you don't need a foam roller? You're a biological disaster. "Stop yelling at me and push on the kneecap," he begged, his imposing, terrifying demeanor entirely dissolved into the pathetic pleading of a man defeated by his own ligaments. The heavy, smoldering romantic tension was completely dead, replaced by the frantic, undignified reality of a roadside medical emergency. And as I aggressively dug my thumbs into his massive, seized thigh while he groaned in pain, I realized something terrifying. I was having the time of my life. Gary unceremoniously dumped us at the chain-link gate of the municipal impound lot. As the massive tow truck rumbled away into the fog, a horrific, ice-cold realization washed over me. "My apartment keys," I whispered, staring through the locked chain-link fence at my dead, impounded van. "They're on the ignition ring, inside the vehicle." Arthur, who had miraculously recovered the use of his leg, stood beside me in the misty darkness. He let out a low, rumbling hum that vibrated right through the soles of my shoes. I believe this is what law enforcement refers to as a cascading operational failure. With nowhere else to go, and the stench of skunk still clinging to us like a physical weight, we ended up at the Suds and Duds 24-hour laundromat. The interior was a cinematic masterpiece of urban decay. The harsh, hyper-realistic glare of the overhead fluorescent lights illuminated every peeling edge of the yellowed linoleum. The air was thick, suffocatingly humid, and choked with the artificial cloying scent of mountain breeze detergent. I had stripped down to a thin cotton tank top and leggings, throwing my ruined outer layers into a heavy-duty industrial washer. Arthur did not belong in a laundromat. He was leaning against a vibrating dryer, his massive arms crossed over his chest. In the stark, volumetric lighting of the neon window sign, every sharp angle of his jaw and every heavy cord of muscle in his forearms was thrown into sharp relief. He looked like an apex predator accidentally trapped in a sterile, coin-operated cage. I aggressively folded a spare, scratchy towel I had purchased from the vending machine, acutely aware of the heavy weight of his gaze. He wasn't even blinking. He was just watching the frantic, exhausted movements of my hands with a dark primal intensity that made the skin on the back of my neck prickle. "You are staring," I pointed out, my voice slightly breathless over the rhythmic, hypnotic thumping of the washing machines. "I am observing," he corrected smoothly. His voice was a low, tactile scrape of gravel that seemed to easily cut through the mechanical noise. "You are remarkably efficient when you are highly stressed. It is fascinating. I am currently homeless, vehicleless, and smelling of organic tomatoes and bleach." "Shh," I snapped, aggressively smoothing a crease into the towel. "If you try to compliment my work ethic right now, I will throw a box of powdered detergent at your head." He let out a soft, dark chuckle. He pushed off the dryer, taking a slow, deliberate step toward me. The ambient heat of the room instantly spiked. I could feel the unnatural, furnace-like warmth radiating off his skin, battling the damp chill of my bare arms. "I was not going to compliment your work ethic," he murmured, his gaze dropping slowly, heavily, to the line of my collarbone. My breath hitched. The air in the narrow aisle suddenly felt too thin to breathe. He took another trapping me between the folding table and his massive chest. I looked up into those glowing amber eyes, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Thwack! A soaking wet, heavy gray gym sock sailed over the aisle of dryers and violently slapped Arthur directly across his stoic, brooding face. The heavy, smoldering romantic tension shattered like cheap glass. Arthur stood frozen, his eyes wide with absolute shock, the wet sock sliding down his aristocratic nose to land on the floor with a pathetic plop. "My bad, dude," a gangly teenager yelled from 3 aisles over, holding an overflowing laundry basket. Arthur slowly turned his head toward the boy, a low, terrifying, distinctly non-human growl building in the absolute depths of his chest. "If you eat that teenager, I am not paying your legal fees," I hissed, shoving Arthur out the glass doors of the laundromat directly into the gray, misty dawn. By 8 in the morning, the adrenaline had completely left my body, replaced by a hollow, jittery exhaustion. My business was sitting behind a locked gate, which meant we were currently standing in the sterile, wood-paneled purgatory of the Oakhaven Town Hall. The air smelled violently of lemon pledge and crushed dreams. Arthur had insisted on handling the municipal claim for my ruined transmission, claiming that as pack leader, his authority would expedite the paperwork. I sat in a tiny, plastic waiting room chair, watching him approach the permitting desk with the slow, confident swagger of a conqueror. Behind the reinforced glass sat a woman with a tightly wound gray bun and a nameplate that read, "Gladys, Senior Compliance Officer." "I need an immediate vehicle release authorization," Arthur rumbled, leaning his massive forearms on the counter. He subtly flared his shoulders, attempting to project an aura of undeniable, alpha dominance. Gladys did not look up from her Sudoku puzzle. Form 40B, in triplicate, notarized. Arthur blinked. "I am Arthur Reed. I oversee the entire—" "I don't care if you oversee the moon's gravitational pull, Mr. Reed," Gladys interrupted, her voice dry as dust. She finally looked up, her magnifying glasses making her eyes look terrifyingly large. Your PAC's zoning permits for the Western Ridge are 3 months delinquent. You are officially in municipal default. I'm not releasing a bicycle to you, let alone a commercial transit van. I watched in absolute fascination as the fearsome, towering alpha of Oak Haven physically shrank. He opened his mouth, closed it, and looked down at his heavy boots, completely and utterly defeated by local bureaucracy. I couldn't take it anymore. I marched up to the counter, wedging myself between Arthur's massive bicep and the glass partition. "Gladys," I said, my voice sharp and entirely devoid of fear. According to Municipal Code 14A, paragraph 3, agricultural and wildlife conservation zones, which his PAC technically falls under, are granted an automatic 90-day grace period pending a secondary environmental review, a review your office failed to schedule. Gladys's pen stopped moving. She narrowed her terrifying, magnified eyes at me. Furthermore, I continued, leaning closer to the glass, if you withhold a commercial vehicle release based on an unrelated zoning clerical error, I will personally file an IRS GRE-raid for improper municipal asset seizure, and I will CC the mayor, the state auditor, and the local news anchor who really likes my dog grooming. A heavy, suffocating silence descended over the lobby. Gladys stared at me. I stared right back, channeling every ounce of my sleep-deprived, caffeinated rage into a single, unyielding glare. Slowly, Gladys reached for her metal stamper. She aggressively stamped a green sheet of paper and slid it under the glass. Window 4 for the keys. Have a blessed day. I snatched the paper, turning to Arthur to tell him to move. The words died in my throat. Arthur was staring down at me. His amber eyes were blown completely wide, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. He wasn't looking at me with intimidation or pity or even casual attraction. He was looking at me with a raw, unfiltered reverence. He looked like a man who had just watched a deity descend from the heavens to do his taxes. He swallowed hard, his voice dropping to a rough, desperate whisper. "You are the most terrifying creature I have ever met." With the vehicle release securely in my pocket, the sheer reality of my empty refrigerator and ruined supplies hit me. We detoured to the local grocery store. The fluorescent lights of aisle 4 buzzed above us, casting stark shadows over the boxes of instant oatmeal and canned beans. The mundane setting felt entirely surreal after the chaos of the last 12 hours. Arthur pushed the squeaky shopping cart with one hand, his massive frame making the metal basket look like a child's toy. "I do not understand why you are buying generic coffee," Arthur grumbled, tossing a heavy bag of dark roast artisan beans into the cart. "You require high-octane caffeine. Your baseline operational state is pure anxiety. I am buying generic because I am currently hovering on the edge of financial ruin," I snapped, snatching the expensive artisan bag out of the cart and aggressively shoving it back onto the top shelf. "I have strict fiscal boundaries, Arthur. I do not accept charity and I do not accept premium coffee from men who break into my van." "It is not charity, it is restitution," he argued, his deep voice vibrating through the cereal aisle. The tension followed us all the way to the checkout lane. The cashier, a bored teenager chewing on a thumbnail, slowly scanned my cheap coffee, a loaf of bread, and a new toothbrush. $14.20. I reached into my pocket for my debit card. A massive, incredibly warm hand suddenly clamped over my wrist. Arthur stepped flush against my back, his chest brushing my shoulder blades. He reached over me with his other hand, holding out a sleek, black titanium credit card. "Put it on this," he rumbled to the cashier. "No," I shouted, the trauma of my past financial ruin instantly overriding my rational brain. I spun around, dropping my center of gravity, and threw my shoulder directly into his solid, muscular chest. It was like body-checking a brick wall. He let out a breathless grunt of surprise, stumbling backward under the sheer, unhinged aggression of my block. "I said I pay for my own things," I hissed, advancing on him. Arthur's eyes flashed. The playful banter evaporated, replaced by a sudden, intense physical challenge. He tried to step around me toward the card reader. I mirrored, planting my hands on his waist and physically shoving him backward. He let out a low, vibrating growl, his hands coming down to grip my hips. The jolt of electricity that shot through my stomach at his touch was paralyzing, but I refused to back down. We were literally wrestling in the checkout lane, a bizarre, silent struggle of dominance right next to the display of breath mints. I twisted, using my leverage to push him back one final, aggressive time. His boots caught the edge of a floor mat. He stumbled, his massive shoulders hitting the candy rack with a metallic crash. I followed him down, pinning his arms against the display shelves, my chest heaving, my face mere inches from his. The cashier slowly backed away from the register. Arthur's chest rose and fell heavily against mine. The fight had completely drained out of him, replaced by a dark, consuming heat that radiated through my clothes. He stared down at my lips, his pupils blown so wide. His eyes looked entirely black. He let his head fall back against the Skittles display, his massive hands slowly unclenching from my hips. "I yield," he whispered, his voice so rough and breathless it sent a violent shiver straight down my spine. The cashier cleared her throat, a loud, painfully awkward sound that shattered the heavy, breathless silence of aisle 4. I immediately dropped my hands from Arthur's chest, taking a frantic step back. My cheeks burned so hot they felt radioactive. Arthur slowly peeled himself off the candy display, a stray package of gummy worms clinging to his broad shoulder. $14.20, I told the cashier, my voice cracking slightly as I blindly swiped my debit card. 30 minutes later, Arthur's beat-up municipal Jeep Cherokee rumbled to a halt over wet gravel. He had demanded, really, that I use the shower at his place before facing the bureaucratic nightmare of the impound lot. I had envisioned a sprawling, luxurious estate. He was the pack leader, after all. Instead, I was staring at a lopsided, weather-beaten wooden structure perched precariously on a cliff overlooking the churning gray ocean. The roof sagged. The front porch had a distinct, terrifying lean. "You run a syndicate of apex predators," I noted, stepping out into the biting coastal wind and pulling my thin diner jacket tighter around myself. "But you do not own a level." "I possess many levels," Arthur grumbled defensively, unlocking a front door that shrieked loudly on rusted hinges. "I just lack the foundational structural integrity to utilize them." The inside of the cabin was a masterclass in drafty misery. The ocean wind literally howled through visible gaps in the window framing, rattling the cheap blinds. It was colder inside the living room than it was out on the cliff. I stood in the center of the faded rug, shivering violently. "Arthur, did you use Scotch tape to caulk that window?" "It is industrial-grade adhesive," he corrected, though he looked suddenly deeply mortified by his own living conditions. He scrubbed a massive hand over his jaw. "I apologize. I have neglected the maintenance. Stay here." He vanished down a dark hallway, returning seconds later carrying a massive, incredibly thick fleece blanket trailing a heavy electrical cord. "Sit," he commanded softly, gesturing to a surprisingly soft-looking leather sofa. I sank into the cushions. Arthur didn't just hand me the blanket. He draped it over my shoulders, meticulously tucking the edges around my shivering arms before plugging it into the wall. Instead of retreating, Arthur sat down right next to me. The leather sofa groaned under his immense weight, the cushions dipping so drastically that I was physically pulled into his side. He didn't pull away. He simply wrapped his massive, heavy arm around my blanket, swaddled shoulders, pulling me flush against his solid chest. The heat radiating through the fleece was immediate and overwhelming. It wasn't the artificial warmth of the blanket's coils. It was him. A deep, heavy, grounding biological heat. "You are freezing," he murmured, his deep voice vibrating right against my temple. The banter died in my throat. The howling wind outside faded into the background, entirely replaced by the slow, steady, deafening rhythm of his heartbeat against my shoulder. I looked up. His face was inches from mine, his glowing eyes tracking the frantic flutter of my pulse at my throat. The air between us evaporated, thickening into a heavy, charged silence, The heavy, charged silence in the freezing cabin stretched until it was suffocating. Arthur was so close I could smell the rain on his skin, mixed with the faint, metallic scent of the ocean. My gaze dropped to his mouth. His jaw clenched, a muscle ticking under his skin as he visibly fought a terrifying, primal internal battle. "Kelsey," he rasped, my name sounding like a rough plea dragged over gravel. "Arthur," I whispered back, my voice completely stripped of its usual cynical bite. He shifted his massive frame, turning fully toward me. His large, remarkably warm hand came up, gently cupping the side of my jaw. His thumb brushed over my cheekbone, sending a violent electric shiver straight down my spine that had absolutely nothing to do with the drafty room. He leaned in. The world tilted. I closed my eyes, as my breath kept catching in my throat, waiting for the inevitable, earth-shattering collision of our lips. Crack! Arthur shifted his weight to pull me closer, planting his heavy steel-toed boot directly onto the frayed edge of the living room rug. The slick hardwood floor beneath the rug offered zero friction. "Whoa," Arthur bellowed. His bad knee buckled instantly. The terrifying alpha of Oakhaven flailed his massive arms, desperately trying to catch his balance, but physics had already made its ruling. He pitched forward, taking me, the heated blanket, and a decorative throw pillow completely over the edge of the sofa. We crashed spectacularly into the heavy oak coffee table, shattering a mug of cold tea, before tumbling into a tangled, chaotic heap on the hardwood floor. The sheer violence of the fall knocked the breath right out of my lungs. I lay flat on my back, staring up at the water-stained ceiling, completely stunned. Arthur was sprawled half over me, his massive elbows taking the brunt of the impact to shield my head, breathing heavily. Are you injured?" he wheezed, his voice filled with absolute, panicked horror. I stared at him, at the utter disaster of this supposedly romantic moment, at his panicked, glowing eyes and the absurdity of our tangled limbs. A bubble of sounds escaped my throat, then a snort. Within a second, I was completely paralyzed by hysterical, breath-stealing laughter. I laughed so hard my ribs ached, clutching the heavy fleece blanket to my chest. Arthur stared down at me, utterly bewildered. But as my laughter echoed off the drafty walls, the panic drained from his face. A slow, devastating grin spread across his rugged features, utterly transforming him from a terrifying predator into someone breathtakingly beautiful. "You are a menace," he murmured, his deep chuckle vibrating against my chest. "You are a structural hazard," I gasped, wiping a tear from my eye. He didn't argue. He just shifted his weight, bracketing my head with his massive hands. He looked down at me, the humor in his eyes burning away into raw, unfiltered desire. "I yield," he whispered. And then, right there on the hard, freezing floor amidst the broken ceramic, he kissed me. It wasn't smooth. It was messy, desperate, and breathless. A chaotic collision of teeth and heat that made my head spin and my heart hammer against my ribs. I tangled my fingers in his hair, pulling him closer, entirely losing myself in the dizzying, perfect disaster of him. Over the next 2 weeks, my life descended into a bizarre, highly administrative mating dance. It started at the impound lot. I was aggressively arguing with the release clerk when Arthur's massive frame materialized behind me. He didn't threaten the clerk. He just handed me a coffee, leaned casually against the counter, and said, "If you were a zoning ordinance, you would be strictly residential, because I want to build a life with you." I had choked on my dark roast. The clerk had looked visibly ill. He didn't stop there. He showed up outside the repair shop where my van was currently on life support. He appeared at the dog park while I was walking a client's neurotic greyhound. He was everywhere, a 250-pound shadow, armed with the worst, most bureaucratically themed pickup lines in human history. "Are you a tax rebate?" he rumbled one Tuesday while I was eating a sandwich on a park bench. "Because my interest in you is compounding annually." "That makes absolutely no mathematical sense," I had shouted, throwing a piece of crust at his head. But the truth was, I wasn't trying very hard to push him away. In fact, I was retaliating in the only way I knew how. If he was going to stalk me with terrible jokes, I was going to violently organize his life. Which is why, on a rainy Thursday night, I was sitting cross-legged on the floor of Arthur's PAC's office behind the town hall. The room was a disaster zone of misfiled 1099s, completely ignored municipal fines, and crumpled receipts. Arthur sat at his heavy mahogany desk, signing documents where I had aggressively placed bright yellow sticky notes. He looked exhausted, but every time he glanced down at me surrounded by his paperwork, his amber eyes softened with a warm, heavy affection. "You claimed a jet ski as a business expense," I stated flatly, holding up a faded receipt from 3 years ago. "Arthur, you are a werewolf pack leader. In what universe is a jet ski a write-off for wildlife conservation?" "It was a tactical watercraft," he argued, not looking up from the liability waiver he was signing, saying, "For coastal patrols." "It is tax fraud," I corrected, tossing it into the reject pile. "I am moving it to personal expenditures. You owe the state government $400. "Do what you must," he sighed, dropping his pen. He stood up, walking around the desk to crouch in front of me. His bad knee popped loudly in the quiet office. He reached out, his massive fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind my ear. The touch was so tender, so incredibly careful, it made my breath hitch. He picked up a stack of perfectly organized, color-coded tax returns I had just finished. "I have lived for 40 years in total chaos," Arthur murmured, his rough voice dropping to a low, intimate frequency that seemed to hum right into my bones. He traced the edge of the manila folder, his gaze locking onto mine with a devastating, possessive intensity. "I did not know what peace looked like until you walked into my office and demanded my receipts." I stared at him, completely and utterly speechless, my heart violently hammering against my ribs. The profound, heart-stopping silence in the office was suddenly shattered by my phone vibrating against the hardwood floor. I blinked, the spell breaking. I scrambled backward, clutching the color-coded tax returns like a shield. I have to go groom a golden doodle." Arthur just smiled, a slow, knowing curve of his mouth, and let me flee into the rain. 2 days later, the administrative backlog finally forced my hand into the wild. The Oakhaven woods were dense, choked with creeping fog and the sharp, pine-heavy scent of damp earth. It was prime real estate for a clandestine gathering of territorial shapeshifters. I, however, was not intimidated by the primal atmosphere. I was annoyed. "Come along, Barnaby," I grunted, aggressively, tugging on a pink, sequined leash. At the other end of the leash was a pristine, freshly blown-out, standard poodle who looked deeply offended by the mud. We crested a ridge, breaking through the tree line into secluded clearing. The tension in the air was thick enough to chew. 6 massive, terrifying men, Arthur's elite pack enforcers, were locked in a heated, low-voiced dispute. Several of them had already partially shifted, their eyes glowing feral yellow, deep guttural growls vibrating in their chests. Arthur stood at the center, radiating absolute, lethal authority. He looked wild, dangerous, and entirely in his element. "The eastern boundary is closed," Arthur barked, his voice echoing like thunder off the ancient pines. "If the river pack contests the crossing, we meet them with—" "Arthur," I shouted, marching straight into the center of the clearing. 6 pairs of glowing, murderous eyes snapped toward me. The enforcers froze, their feral growls dying in their throats as they stared in absolute shock at the 5'3" woman in a bright yellow rain slicker, dragging a fluffy dog through their war council. Arthur blinked. The lethal, terrifying alpha aura instantly evaporated. "Kelsey," he rasped, looking frantically between me and the poodle. What are you doing in the tactical zone?" "You forgot to sign the liability waiver for the town hall fundraiser." I marched right up to his massive chest, shoving a clipboard and a ballpoint pen into his hands. "I cannot legally assemble the dunk tank without your signature. Sign it, now." One of the enforcers, a hulking guy with a scar over his eye, let out a confused, offended whine. "Alpha, is she challenging you?" "She is organizing me," Arthur corrected quickly, looking genuinely terrified that I might scold his enforcers. He meekly took the pen. "Barnaby is getting mud on his paws, Arthur." Speed it up, I tapped my foot impatiently. He scribbled his name, entirely ignoring the bewildered stares of his deadliest fighters. He handed the clipboard back, his lips twitching with suppressed amusement. "Thank you," I huffed, turning on my heel. "Have fun at your forest screaming match. Let's go, Barnaby." I marched back into the trees, but just before the fog swallowed me, I heard Arthur's voice, pitched low and dripping with unmistakable, ridiculous pride. "That is my accountant," he told the enforcers. "Do not ever cross her." The relentless coastal rain lashed against the single-pane window of my tiny second-floor apartment. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the bitter, distinctly depressing aroma of burnt, freeze-dried coffee. Arthur was sitting on my two-seater sofa, a piece of furniture that was entirely surrendering under his immense bulk. His knees were practically touching his chin. We had transitioned from daylight municipal encounters to him showing up at my door at 9 at night, holding a jar of instant coffee as a peace offering. I sat cross-legged on the floor, nursing a chipped mugs, my cynical armor finally cracking under the weight of the miserable weather and his quiet, unyielding presence. "It wasn't just a business failing," I murmured, staring down at the dark liquid. My voice felt brittle, hollowed out by the memory. "Mark, my ex-partner, he didn't just steal the capital. He put everything in my name right before the bankruptcy. He smiled at me over dinner, told me he loved me, and then left me holding $80,000 in defaulted loans." The silence in the cramped apartment stretched, heavy and suffocating. I braced myself. I waited for the inevitable alpha reaction. I expected Arthur to flex his massive shoulders, to growl about vengeance, to demand Mark's current address so he could inflict severe blunt force trauma. I expected him to try and fix the unfixable. Arthur didn't move. He carefully set his impossibly small mug on the coffee table. He leaned forward, resting his thick forearms on his knees, his gaze tracking the nervous tremor in my hands. "That is why you fight everyone who tries to pay for your groceries," he said softly. It wasn't a question. It was a profound, quiet understanding that felt like a physical weight settling over my shoulders. "If I don't owe anyone," I whispered, fighting the sudden humiliating sting of tears in my eyes, "nobody can pull the rug out from under me." Arthur slowly slid off the protesting sofa, dropping down onto the floor right in front of me. The sheer size of him in my cramped living room was overwhelming, yet entirely grounding. He didn't reach for his wallet. He didn't offer to magically erase my debt with PAC funds. Instead, he reached out and gently wrapped his large, calloused hands over mine, completely engulfing the chipped coffee mug. "I am not going to offer to pay your loans, Kelsey." His gravelly voice was a low, steady rumble that vibrated through my fingertips. "I know that would insult you." I let out a shaky, relieved breath. "Thank you." "But," he continued, his glowing amber eyes locking onto mine with a fierce, unwavering devotion, "I am going to sit right here on this terrible floor, and I am going to drink this abysmal coffee, and I am not going anywhere, ever." The absolute certainty in his voice stripped away my last defense. I leaned forward, resting my forehead against his broad, solid chest. He let out a soft exhale, resting his chin on top of my head, his arms coming up to hold me tight. It wasn't a rescue. It was a partnership, and it felt terrifyingly right. Right until his stomach let out a thunderous, monstrous growl that entirely ruined the tender moment. "Right," he coughed, his cheeks flushing. "Tomorrow night, my cabin, I am cooking. I will prove I possess domestic survival skills." Arthur's idea of domestic survival skills was, predictably, a catastrophic miscalculation of his own abilities. When I pulled up to his drafty beachfront cabin the next evening, I didn't smell roasting chicken or garlic. I heard the frantic, unmistakable sound of rushing water and a man aggressively cursing at a pipe. "Arthur?" I pushed the creaky front door open, dropping my purse on the entryway table. "Do not enter the kitchen." His panicked, gravelly voice echoed from the back of the house. "I have breached the hull." I sprinted down the hallway. The kitchen was an absolute disaster zone. A solid geyser of freezing, high-pressure tap water was rocketing straight up into the air, violently bouncing off the ceiling and raining down over the entire room. Arthur was on his knees under the sink, completely drenched, frantically wrestling with a heavy metal pipe wrench. "I attempted to fix the slow drip before you arrived," he bellowed over the roar of the water, swiping a curtain of wet hair out of his glowing amber eyes. "The structural integrity was compromised. Turn off the main valve," I yelled, stepping into the room. My sensible sneakers immediately hit the flooded linoleum. Zero traction. My feet flew out from under me. I let out a breathless shriek, windmilling my arms in a desperate attempt to defy gravity. Arthur lunged forward to catch me. He abandoned the wrench, his massive frame sliding across the wet floor like a derailed freight train. He caught me by the waist, but his bad knee instantly betrayed him on the slick surface. We went down in a spectacular, chaotic tangle of limbs. Water showered over us like an indoor monsoon as we crashed onto the flooded linoleum. Arthur absorbed the brunt of the impact, groaning loudly as my elbow dug sharply into his ribs. "Are you okay?" I gasped, pushing wet hair out of my face, entirely soaked to the bone. "My pride is critically wounded," he wheezed, his massive chest heaving against mine. He looked up at the ceiling, where the water was still aggressively spraying. "I wanted to make you a risotto." I looked at him. The terrifying alpha, the leader of the region's deadliest predators, lying in 2 inches of tap water, with a piece of soft spinach clinging to his jaw. "You are a disaster," I laughed, the sound bubbling up through the freezing spray. "I am," he agreed, his voice suddenly dropping an octave. He didn't try to get up. The chaotic humor of the moment abruptly shifted. The frantic energy of the flooded kitchen faded into the background, completely overpowered by the sudden, heavy realization of her physical proximity. I was sprawled directly on top of him. My wet clothes clung to my skin, and his soaked flannel shirt did nothing to hide the hard, shifting muscles of his chest. His large hands tightened on my waist, the playfulness in his amber eyes burning away into something dark, possessive, and desperately hungry. "Kelsey," he murmured, his voice a rough, tactile scrape over the roar of the plumbing. He shifted his hips, entirely trapping me against him. The cold water didn't matter. The broken sink didn't matter. There was only the dizzying, breathless tension pulling us together. And then he reached up and dragged my mouth down to his. The icy spray from the detonated sink pipe hammered against my back like frozen needles, but I couldn't feel the cold. Arthur's mouth was a localized, devastating inferno. He didn't kiss like a composed, terrifying pack leader. He kissed like a man who had tripped over his own feet and finally found his center of gravity. It was a frantic, breathless collision of teeth and desperate heat. My hands scrambled over his soaked flannel shirt, gripping his broad, muscular shoulders as the flooded linoleum completely lost its structural integrity beneath us. With a low, vibrating groan, Arthur shifted his massive weight. He didn't bother trying to stand up gracefully. He just planted his heavy boots, gripped my waist, and hauled us both off the floor in one fluid, powerful surge. Water cascaded off his broad shoulders as he backed me directly into the edge of the kitchen island. "Wait," I gasped, breaking the kiss for a fraction of a second. "The water main? The drywall? Let it drown," he rasped. He pressed his forehead against mine. His chest heaved, his breathing harsh and uneven over the deafening roar of the indoor geyser. The sheer physical size of him was completely overwhelming, trapping me against the counter, but the way his hands trembled on my hips stripped away every ounce of intimidation. I blindly reached behind me, my fingers closing around the heavy, cold metal of the discarded pipe wrench sitting on the granite. I had a fleeting, deeply responsible urge to wedge it onto the valve. Arthur's large, blisteringly hot hands slid up my ribcage, his thumbs brushing the soaked cotton of my shirt just beneath my collarbone. His amber eyes were blown wide, completely black in the center, fixated on my face with a terrifying, raw vulnerability. "I am a disaster," he whispered, against my jaw, his deep voice cracking under the weight of the confession. I looked at the water actively ruining his ceiling. I looked at the mud still caked on his boots from his ridiculous pack meeting. I felt the overwhelming, heavy devotion pouring off his skin. My grip on the heavy tool loosened. "You are," I agreed breathlessly. I let the pipe wrench slip from my fingers. It hit the floor with a heavy, metallic clank, completely surrendering the kitchen to the flood. "But you're my disaster." Arthur let out a ragged exhale that sounded almost like a sob. He crushed his mouth back against mine, entirely eliminating the space between us. There was no banter left to hide behind. The power dynamic completely leveled out, leaving nothing but the raw, electric friction of wet clothes, burning skin, and a desperate, suffocating need. He lifted me off the floor, setting me onto the cold granite counter. My legs immediately tangled around his waist, pulling him flush against me. "Kelsey," he groaned, his mouth trailing hot, frantic kisses down the side of my neck, his hands fiercely gripping my hips. The Oakhaven boardwalk was a miserable gray stretch of splintering wood that smelled permanently of low tide, damp moss, and fried dough. By Tuesday afternoon, the plumbing disaster was a memory handled by a very confused, highly paid emergency contractor. We were currently walking along the railing, the biting coastal wind whipping my hair into my eyes. Arthur was holding 2 foil-wrapped hot dogs from a rusted vendor cart. He looked completely ridiculous. His massive, imposing frame was swathed in a heavy wool peacoat that made him look like a brooding lighthouse keeper, violently contrasting with the cheap mustard-stained street food in his enormous hands. "I do not understand the nutritional value of this," Arthur rumbled, staring suspiciously at the unnaturally bright red casing of his frankfurter. "It isn't about nutrition, it's about the psychological comfort of sodium," I corrected, taking a bite of mine. "You eat raw steak. You have no culinary high ground here." He let out a low huff of amusement, stopping near a rusted telescope viewer. He turned to face me, completely ignoring his food. The atmospheric humor slowly bled out of the damp air. Arthur's posture shifted. He squared those massive shoulders, his glowing amber eyes locking onto mine with a sudden, devastating gravity. The heavy rolling crash of the ocean waves against the pylons below suddenly sounded incredibly loud. "Kelsey," he began, his deep voice dropping into that rough, intimate frequency that always made my stomach do a violent flip. "Arthur, your hot dog is dripping on your boot," I pointed out, my defense mechanisms automatically flaring up in the face of his intense sincerity. He didn't look down. He reached out with his free hand, gently cupped the side of my face. His thumb brushed over my cheekbone, his skin radiating that unnatural, comforting heat against the biting wind. "I do not care about the boot," he murmured. His gaze dropped on my lips before lifting back to my eyes. "I care about the fact that my entire life was a cold, chaotic administrative void before you backed your ruined van into my existence. I care about—" He took a deep, shaky breath, his thumb tracing my jawline. He was completely dropping his armor. "I care about you. I think I am falling." Screech! A massive, aggressive blur of white feathers and demonic energy violently dive-bombed from the gray sky. A 3-pound coastal seagull slammed directly into Arthur's chest, its beak snapping with lethal precision. In a blur of motion, it ripped the entire foil-wrapped hot dog right out of the terrifying alpha's massive hand. Arthur stumbled backward, his eyes wide with absolute, unfiltered shock as the bird aggressively flapped away with its screeching in victory. "Did that bird just mug me?" he gasped, staring at his empty, mustard-stained fingers. I stared at him. I stared at the retreating seagull. A hysterical bubble of laughter erupted from my throat, completely shattering the heavy, romantic tension. "Nature has asserted its dominance," I cackled, holding my stomach. Arthur looked offended for a fraction of a second before a slow, self-deprecating grin broke across his face. He shook his head, stepping forward to pull me into his chest, laughing with me. But the laughter died in my throat when the sharp, shrill ringtone of my cell phone pierced the air. I pulled it from my pocket, wiping a tear of mirth from my eye. I glanced at the cracked screen. The world stopped turning. The ocean noise faded into a dull, terrifying roar. Mark Davis. The name of my ex-partner, the man who had stolen my capital, bankrupted my life, and destroyed my ability to trust, flashed on the caller ID. And underneath the name, a terrifyingly new, localized GPS tag. Current location, Oakhaven. The air inside my cramped second-floor apartment felt like it had been sucked through a vacuum. I stood in the center of the faded rug, staring blindly at the blank wall. My phone felt like a live grenade in my hand. Mark had left a voicemail. He wasn't calling to apologize. He was calling from the Oakhaven motel down the street, gleefully informing me that his lawyers had found a loophole in our dissolved LLC. He was coming for the last physical asset I possessed, the mobile grooming van currently sitting in the impound lot. He was going to take the final piece of my livelihood. I will shatter his femurs. Arthur's voice was a dark, vibrating rumble that physically shook the window panes. He was pacing the tiny perimeter of my living room like a caged predator. The clumsy, sweet man who had just been mugged by a seagull was entirely gone. In his place was the alpha. His broad shoulders were pulled tight, heavily corded with tension. His eyes weren't just glowing. They were practically burning, a feral, terrifying amber that pierced the gloom of the room. A deep, continuous growl reverberated in his chest, an involuntary biological response to a threat against his territory. "Arthur, stop pacing. You're going to break the floorboards," I said, my voice sounding incredibly thin and brittle. "Give me the motel name," he demanded, stopping dead in his tracks. He turned toward me, his hands curled into massive white-knuckled fists. "I will handle this. He will sign the release forms, and then he will leave this town, or he will not leave it walking." Panic cold, sharp and suffocating, spiked in my chest. It wasn't panic over Mark. It was panic over Arthur. The absolute terrifying certainty in his voice triggered every single buried trauma from my past. The promise of someone else handling my life. The aggressive removal of my agency. Mark had taken my choices away with a smile. Arthur was trying to take them away with a growl. It was different packaging, but it was the exact same loss of control. "No," I snapped, taking a step back. Arthur blinked, the feral intensity faltering for a second. "Kelsey, the man is a predator. You cannot face him alone." "I have faced him alone for 3 years," I shouted, the raw, defensive anger finally boiling over. I pointed a shaking finger at his broad chest. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. You think, because you're big and scary, you get to bulldoze my life to fix it? You don't get to manage me, Arthur." "I am trying to protect you," he roared back, the sheer volume of his voice rattling the cheap light fixtures. "I don't want protection. I want a partner," I screamed, my throat burning. The echo of my voice hung in the heavy, suffocating silence. Arthur stared at me, his chest heaving, his amber eyes wide with a mixture of shock and desperate frustration. He didn't understand. His biological instinct was screaming at him to destroy the threat, completely blinding him to the fact that his protection was suffocating me. I walked over to the apartment door. I grabbed the deadbolt, throwing it open, and stared him dead in the eyes. "This is my business. This is my fight," I told him, my voice dropping to a cold, trembling whisper. "I need you to leave." "Kelsey, please," he rasped, taking a desperate half-step forward. "If you step in," I promised him, my knuckles white on the doorknob, "if you go behind my back to fix this, we are done. Walk out, Arthur." He stared at me for 3 agonizing seconds. Then, with a heavy, devastated exhalation that sounded like a physical wound, the giant man stepped over the threshold and walked away into the rain. The rain in Oakhaven did not just fall. It existed as a permanent, oppressive state of being, hanging in the air like a suffocating, freezing mist. I hadn't slept a single minute. My eyes burned. My throat felt like it was lined with shattered glass, and my hands carried a faint, pathetic tremor as I pulled my threadbare rain slicker over my shoulders. I had spent the entire night meticulously drafting a battle plan. I had reviewed municipal impound codes, highlighted the microscopic print on my dissolved LLC documents, and prepared myself for absolute, unmitigated war against Mark Davis. I was terrified, but for the first time in 3 years, I felt a sharp, dangerous spark of agency. I was going to walk down to that motel, look my nightmare in the eye, and fight for the pathetic, broken, skunk-scented van that belonged to me. I pushed open the heavy lobby door of my apartment building, stepping out into the gray, waterlogged morning. I stopped dead in my tracks. The breath was violently punched right out of my lungs. Parked illegally across 3 resident spaces was a behemoth of a vehicle. It was a brand new, extended wheelbase, top-of-the-line Mercedes Sprinter grooming van. It was blindingly, unnaturally white, completely devoid of rust or dents. Through the heavily tinted, custom-cut windows, I could see the gleaming chrome of dual state-of-the-art hydrobaths and a fully integrated LED-lit grooming table. It easily cost $250,000, and leaning against the massive chrome grille, looking like a terrifying, rain-soaked mythological guardian, was Arthur. He was wearing his heavy wool peacoat, his dark hair plastered against his forehead by the mist. When he saw me, he pushed off the grill. His broad shoulders were squared, his chest expanded, and his glowing amber eyes radiated a profound, overwhelming sense of alpha pride. He looked like a warrior returning from a victorious, blood-soaked campaign. "I have neutralized the threat," his deep, gravelly voice echoed across the empty, wet asphalt. It was a rumble of absolute, unwavering authority. I couldn't move. My boots felt like they were cast in concrete. A sickening, icy dread began to coil in the pit of my stomach, completely suffocating the fragile spark of agency I had nurtured all night. "Arthur." My voice was barely a whisper, completely hollowed out. "What is this?" He took a heavy, confident step toward me. He reached into his deep coat pocket and pulled out a heavy ring of pristine silver keys. They jingled loudly in the quiet morning, a sharp, metallic sound that made me physically flinch. "Your former partner found a loophole in your dissolved operational contract," Arthur explained, his tone completely matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing a weather pattern. "He possessed a legal right to seize your broken transit van, so I let him have it. It is currently being towed to the scrapyard." You let him take my van?" My ears started to ring. The cold mist suddenly felt like ice water in my veins. "It was a tactical sacrifice," Arthur continued, stepping closer, completely oblivious to the catastrophic shift in my posture. He held out the gleaming keys, his eyes shining with heavy, possessive devotion. "I used the 6 Emergency Discretionary Fund. This vehicle is fully licensed, completely insured, and registered solely under a new, impenetrable municipal trust. Mark Davis has absolutely no legal jurisdiction over this asset. Your business is safe, Kelsey. You are safe." He smiled. It was a genuine, beautiful, deeply relieved smile. He thought he had saved me. He didn't realize he had just completely destroyed me. I stared at the keys dangling from his massive, calloused fingers. I didn't see a gift, I saw a cage. I saw the exact same suffocating, manipulative control that Mark had used when he quietly transferred all our business loans into my name. Mark had used my trust to ruin me. Arthur was using his wealth and his primal instincts to completely overwrite my existence. "You didn't neutralize a threat," I whispered, my voice trembling so violently I could barely form the words. I looked up, meeting his glowing amber eyes. "You neutralized me." Arthur's smile instantly vanished. His heavy brow furrowed in genuine, bewildered confusion. "Kelsey, I do not understand. I solved the logistical crisis. You no longer have to fight." "I wanted to fight," I screamed, the raw, devastated sound tearing through the misty parking lot. Arthur physically recoiled, stepping back as if I had struck him with the dematting comb all over again. "I explicitly told you to stay out of it," I choked out, tears of absolute furious heartbreak finally spilling over my lashes, mixing with the cold rain. "I drew one boundary, Arthur. One. I told you that I needed to fix my own life, and you completely ignored me because your arrogant, suffocating alpha complex couldn't handle watching me struggle. I cannot stand by and watch my mate be threatened by a predator," he roared back, his own panic finally breaking. Through his stoic facade, the sheer volume of his voice vibrated in my chest. "It goes against every biological imperative in my body. I am supposed to provide. I am supposed to protect." I don't want to be a pet project that you fund with PAC money, I sobbed, aggressively wiping my face. I wanted a partner who respected me enough to let me hold my own ground. You didn't protect my business, Arthur. You bought it. And in doing so, you bought me. No, he gasped, his eyes going wide with absolute horror as the realization finally, devastatingly clicked into place. Kelsey, no, that is not. I don't want your van, I interrupted, my voice dropping to a dead, icy calm that terrified even me. I stepped forward, snatched the heavy ring of keys from his frozen hand, and violently hurled them squarely at his broad chest. The metal struck his wool coat with a heavy thud before clattering to the wet asphalt between us. Arthur stared down at the keys, his massive chest heaving, his face entirely drained of color. He looked completely, utterly broken. You promised you wouldn't step in, I told him, turning my back on the blinding white van and the giant man standing beside it. We're done, Arthur. I didn't wait for a response. I pulled my thin rain slicker tight around my body, walked out into the relentless, freezing downpour, and left him standing alone in the wreckage of his terrible grand gesture. The rain had finally stopped, but it left behind a thick, suffocating fog that clung to the cracked asphalt of the Dive Diner parking lot. The neon sign for Smitty's 24-hour grill buzzed with a frantic, dying electrical hum, casting harsh, flickering red shadows over the wet pavement. I was standing perfectly still, staring at a silver, mid-sized luxury rental sedan. 30 minutes ago, I had sat in a vinyl booth across from Mark Davis. He had worn a custom-tailored suit that cost more than my entire net worth. He had ordered an espresso, smiled his terrifyingly perfect, hollow smile, and informed me that my impounded van had already been crushed into a cube of scrap metal. He had also, entirely unprompted, made a deeply derogatory comment about the hygiene of my favorite client, Barnaby, the standard poodle. Then he had walked out, leaving me with the check. My hands were shaking. The adrenaline from the morning's heartbreak with Arthur had entirely curdled into a dark, thick, consuming rage. It was a quiet, dangerous fury that completely bypassed my logical brain. I looked down at the slick, oil-stained asphalt. Lying near a concrete parking block was a rusted, heavy piece of a discarded tailpipe. I didn't think, I just moved. I bent down, my fingers wrapping around the freezing, jagged metal. I stood up, gripping the pipe with both hands, marching directly toward the rear driver's side tire of Mark's pristine rental car. I raised the pipe high above my head, let out a breathless, furious scream, and brought it down with every ounce of my strength. Clang! The rusted tire bounced violently off the reinforced rubber of the tire, the kinetic shockwave reverberating painfully up my arms and rattling my teeth. I let out a frustrated sob, raising the pipe to strike again. I wanted to break glass. I wanted to shatter metal. I wanted to physically manifest the absolute ruin of my day. Before I could swing, the heavy, unmistakable crunch of boots on wet gravel echoed through the fog. I froze, the rusted pipe hovering above my head. Through the red neon mist, a massive, imposing silhouette materialized. Arthur didn't arrive in a screeching panic. He didn't rush me. He walked with a slow, deliberate, terrifyingly heavy stride, his hands completely empty. He was still wearing the damp wool peacoat, his jaw locked in a rigid line. My chest heaved. I gripped the pipe tighter, my defensive armor instantly slamming back into place. If you are here to pacify me, I will throw this at your head, I warned him, my voice cracking under the sheer weight of my exhaustion. If you try to tell me that property damage is beneath me, or if you brought a checkbook to pay for his rental deposit, I swear to God, Arthur. The structural integrity of a rusted exhaust pipe is severely compromised, Arthur interrupted. His deep, gravelly voice was entirely devoid of judgment. It was perfectly, remarkably calm. If you strike the alloy rim at that specific angle, the pipe will shatter, and the shrapnel will undoubtedly lacerate your face. I blinked, completely thrown off balance by the bizarre, logistical critique of my vandalism. What? Arthur didn't explain. He closed the remaining distance between us in 3 long strides. The sudden, overwhelming furnace heat of his massive body instantly combated the damp chill of the fog. He smelled like ozone, dark pine, and heavy, unfiltered tension. He didn't reach for my hands. He didn't try to take the pipe away from me. Instead, he stepped flush against my back. My breath caught violently in my throat. His broad, muscular chest pressed heavily against my shoulder blades. I could feel the rapid, thundering rhythm of his heartbeat right through my rain slicker. Arthur reached over my shoulder with his right hand. In his massive grip was a solid forged steel, four-way lug wrench he had pulled from his Jeep. "Drop the pipe," he murmured, his deep voice dropping to a rough, tactile vibration right next to my ear. It sent a violent, paralyzing shiver straight down my spine. I let the rusted pipe clatter to the asphalt. Arthur slowly, deliberately slid the heavy steel lug wrench into my trembling hands. His large, calloused fingers brushed over my knuckles, a fleeting touch of searing heat, before he adjusted my grip. He moved my hands further apart on the metal crossbar, ensuring I had maximum leverage. "You," I whispered, completely paralyzed by the overwhelming physical proximity and the sheer impossibility of what he was doing. "You aren't going to stop me?" "I am never stopping you again," Arthur rasped, his breath hot against the sensitive skin of my neck. "I am going to stand right behind you. And if you miss, I will hand you a heavier tool." Tears pricked the corners of my eyes, not from heartbreak, but from a profound, earth-shattering wave of relief. He finally understood. He wasn't trying to manage the threat. He wasn't trying to buy my safety. He was simply arming me for my own war. Arthur stepped back just enough to give my shoulders clearance, though his heavy, radiating heat still completely enveloped me. "Swing from the hips," he instructed softly, his glowing amber eyes fixed intensely on the side of the sedan. "The taillight casing is heavy-duty plastic, but the rear quarter panel is standard aluminum. It will dent beautifully." I gripped the cold steel of the lug wrench. I planted my boots on the wet asphalt, twisting my torso just like he said. I locked my eyes onto the pristine, shiny silver metal of Mark Davis's rental car. I swung. Crunch. The satisfying, violent sound of shattering plastic and buckling aluminum echoed like a gunshot across the empty parking lot. The red taillight exploded into 100 glittering pieces across the wet pavement. I stood there, breathless, staring at the massive, catastrophic dent I had just inflicted upon the universe. A low, dark, incredibly arrogant chuckle vibrated from the giant man standing behind me. "Excellent form," Arthur murmured, his heavy hands coming down to rest firmly on my hips, pulling my back flush against his chest once again. "Now, do the other side." The second taillight exploded with an even more spectacular, plastic-shattering crunch. I dropped the heavy steel lug wrench. It hit the wet pavement with a loud, metallic clang that perfectly punctuated the absolute destruction of Mark Davis's rental deposit. My chest was heaving, my hair was plastered to my forehead with fog and sweat, and my hands were stinging from the kinetic shockwave of the impact. But for the first time in 3 years, I felt incredibly, entirely light. Arthur's massive hands remained firmly planted on my hips. He didn't pull away. He just stood there, completely unfazed by the felony property damage unfolding in the diner parking lot. "Do you feel logistically balanced?" he asked, his deep voice vibrating right into my spine. "I feel like I need a lawyer," I admitted breathlessly, leaning back against his solid, furnace-like chest, "and maybe a hot shower." "I know a terrible, drafty cabin," he murmured, his nose brushing the damp hair behind my ear. "The plumbing has been recently, aggressively renovated." An hour later, the ocean wind was howling a violent, rhythmic assault against the thin glass of Arthur's beachfront living room. We were sitting on the floor in front of a struggling, desperately small fire in the stone hearth. I was wrapped entirely in the massive, heated fleece blanket, wet clothes discarded in the hall. Arthur was sitting cross-legged beside me, wearing a dry, faded gray t-shirt that stretched entirely too tight across his broad shoulders. He was meticulously, intensely applying a small cartoon dog bandage to a scrape on my knuckle, a casualty of the flying taillight shrapnel. This is a negotiation of terms, I announced, pulling my hand back and tucking it under the heated fleece. If we are going to do this, whatever this highly administrative, deeply chaotic partnership is, there are ground rules. Arthur leaned back on his hands, his long legs stretching out toward the hearth. His bad knee gave a soft, audible pop. He looked at me, his amber eyes entirely devoid of that suffocating, commanding intensity. Instead, he just looked completely, hopelessly devoted. "Dictate your terms," he rumbled, the corner of his mouth twitching upward. "Rule number 1, I stated, holding up a single finger from beneath the blanket. No grand, sweeping financial rescues. If my business is failing, you do not buy me a spaceship-grade transit van. You let me figure it out. If I ask for a loan, we draft a legally binding repayment schedule with a fixed APR. I will agree to a 0% interest rate," he countered smoothly, "because I am romantically invested in your credit score. Negotiable," I conceded, trying to suppress a smile. "Rule number 2, I keep my absolute independence. You do not manage my conflicts. You do not growl at my clients. If a terrier spites me, you do not retaliate against the terrier." "I will abstain from canine warfare," Arthur swore, crossing a massive hand over his heart, "unless the terrier possesses a lethal weapon. Then I am stepping in." Rule number 3, I shifted closer to the fire, the ambient heat of the flames entirely overshadowed by the blistering warmth radiating off his body. "You handle all heavy lifting, jar opening and high shelf retrieval, because you are essentially a commercial forklift. A biological necessity," he agreed, his voice dropping a fraction of an octave, "given my skeletal dimensions. And finally," I whispered, the banter slowly bleeding out of the freezing room, replaced by a heavy, suffocating gravity. "You let me do your taxes, because your filing system is a crime against the federal government, and it physically pains me." Arthur didn't laugh. He didn't offer a witty, bureaucratic retort. He shifted his massive frame, closing the scant few inches between us. He reached out, his large, calloused hands gently gripping the edges of the fleece blanket wrapped around my shoulders. With one slow, deliberate tug, he pulled me entirely off the hardwood floor and directly onto his lap. My breath caught violently in my throat. I ended up straddling his muscular thighs, the heavy blanket pooling around our waists. The physical proximity was sudden and completely overwhelming. I could feel every hard, shifting plane of his chest against mine, the intense heat of his skin burning right through his thin shirt, chasing away the coastal chill. He looked up at me, his glowing eyes completely black in the center, dilated with a raw, desperate hunger that made my pulse pound a frantic rhythm against my collarbone. "I accept your term," Arthur murmured, his rough hands sliding under the blanket to grip my waist. His thumbs pressed into my sides, sending a violent jolt of electricity straight down my spine. "But I have one addendum." "Which is?" I gasped, tangling my fingers into the dark, thick hair at the nape of his neck. "You are the only person who gets to organize me," he rasped, his mouth hovering mere millimeters from mine. "You manage the paperwork. I will manage the heavy lifting." "You're an administrative nightmare," I breathed, closing the distance and pressing my lips against his jaw. Arthur let out a low, dark, possessing growl that vibrated right through my bones. He crushed his mouth against mine, entirely devouring my laugh, pulling me tight against his chest as the ocean wind howled against the glass. A perfect, chaotic, beautifully absurd disaster.